Okay, everybody, I'm delighted to welcome you all tonight to this talk. We're very lucky to be joined by Fionnuala Walsh, Dr. Fionnuala Walsh from University College Dublin, who's going to present to us some material from her research into Irish women and the Great War, which was her recently published book on the subject. And if you want to buy the book, there's a link at the bottom of the screen. Fionnuala promises that she's going to give us some national information and some local links as well. And the book was nominated for the Royal Historical Society's, or shortlisted for the Royal Historical Society's Whitfield Prize. So very prestigious research we're getting here tonight. So without further ado, I'll just hand it over to Fionnuala.
Great, thanks for that, Tommy. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, you should be able to see my slides there. Okay, many thanks for the invitation to speak to you all today. It's a great pleasure to do so. As Tommy was saying, I'm going to talk about some of my experiences, some of my research into experiences of women in Ireland during the First World War, and then briefly discuss my approach to this research for the book that, as Tommy mentioned, was published just last summer. When the war broke out in August 1914, many women in Ireland felt some relief, realising that it offered a chance to escape civil war on the island of Ireland over the issue of Home Rule. They recorded in their diaries their confusion and their bewilderment at the rapid pace of change, but they had little concept of the toll that the war would take or how much would have changed by the time peace was restored 4 years later. An estimated 206,000 Irish men voluntarily served in the British Army during the war from Ireland. Many of them motivated by posters such as these ones, saying to them, "Will you answer the call? Now is the time." Or this one, which is an image that I use for the cover of my book, asking the man, "Will you go or must I?" In a parallel service, thousands of Irish women became involved in activities to support the war effort. They hoped that their war service might bring about some reconciliation between divided communities. They sought fulfillment from their restricted domestic spheres, or were simply hoping to find some means of alleviating the inevitable suffering associated with war. This mobilisation took many forms, including nursing wounded soldiers, preparing hospital supplies and parcels of comforts, undertaking auxiliary military roles in port areas or behind the lines, and producing weapons of war. In total, the war effort drew in significantly more women than the suffrage campaign, or indeed the Republican movement, and it created new roles and opportunities for the thousands of women who were already active in the sizable female unionist organisations. For most of the years 1914 to 1918, many more women in Ireland were actively engaged in activities supporting the British war effort than in resisting the state and participating in insurrection. Irish women from all classes, religious and political backgrounds participated in voluntary activities to support the war effort. Across the island of Ireland, over 13,000 women enrolled with the Joint Committee of the British Red Cross and St John Ambulance Association. Over 500 of these women served overseas, close to the front. Although Red Cross activity was more common in urban areas, there are branches in every region of Ireland. In County Louth, for example, there was a Red Cross division with 66 active members, five of whom had served overseas during the war. And by overseas, we mean beyond Ireland or Britain. There were also sub-depots affiliated to the Irish War Hospital Supply Depot in Dundalk and Castlebellingham, which produced wound dressings and bandages to send to hospitals close to the front. The women involved with the Red Cross or the Irish War Hospital Supply Depot came from a mix of backgrounds. The majority were Protestants, but significant numbers of Catholics were also involved. Many held paid employment or worked on the family farm, volunteering in their spare time. Many of the women enrolled with the organisation did so solely on a part-time capacity, given a few hours a week service in a hospital supply depot or a work party where they might make clothes for soldiers. Such service enabled women with home or work duties to support the war effort. For example, Margaret Lyons from Drogheda volunteered with the Red Cross throughout the war, making clothes for soldiers. I found her record from the 1911 census, which indicates that she was in her early 20s at the time of the war. She was from a Catholic farming background, and she was living in a basic third-class house. She likely had duties on the family farm and limited time to provide, but was nonetheless willing to give up some of her limited spare time to support the war effort in what way she could. In contrast, Judith and Julia Byrne, two sisters from Rossmackie, Dundalk, served in a nursing role, first in the County Louth Red Cross Auxiliary Hospital, and then in the Curragh Military Hospital in Kildare, but later on in a hospital in Italy. And indeed, they were still serving there after the war ended in 1919. They were Catholics from a more prosperous farming background, evident in the fact that in the 1911 census, the family had 3 servants living with them. While voluntary work was more accessible to upper-class women, class was most important in dictating the type of voluntary work performed by women. Hundreds of Irish women also served with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and over 100 Irish women served with the Royal Naval Service. It's difficult for us to have precise numbers of how many Irish women served with these organisations, because many of the records which are held in the National Archives in London were destroyed during the Blitz in the Second World War. So only a small percentage survive, and as these are a random percentage, so we can search them for Irish names and Irish locations, but we don't have the we don't know how many Irish were among the original full records. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established in June 1917 by the War Office to provide support services for the British Army to release more men from military service. It arose out of 2 voluntary organisations, the Women's Voluntary Reserve and the Women's Legion, both founded by a woman with strong Irish connections, Edith, 7th Marchioness of Londonderry. Aware of the potential criticism, Lady Londonderry emphasised that the objects of the reserve were diametrically opposed to ostentatious displays of women, stamping up and down the country, bristling with firearms, and making themselves ridiculous. In an account of the organisation's establishment, written in 1944, Lady Londonderry recalled how many people were deeply prejudiced at the prospect of women performing war work outside of the traditional female spheres of nursing, sewing, or cooking. So even though the women in these organisations were not actually fighting, the fact that they were in uniform and that they were taking on more sort of specialist roles and working very closely with the actual soldiers meant that there was some concern about what they might be, what their behaviour and how suitable this was to the gendered norms of the time. In summer 1915, Lady Londonderry established a Women's Legion, which supplied cooks and drivers and other women workers for the army. There were active Legion detachments in Belfast, Cork, and Dublin. When the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established in 1917, hundreds of Irish women joined, serving some of them at home in Ireland, some in Britain, and many in France, as clerks, waitresses, cooks, and drivers. From my examination of the records in the National Archives in London, I found that most of these women were Catholic and working class. The women from Ireland, that is. Members were likely motivated by a combination of patriotic and economic factors. Some, such as Sophie Pearce-Evans, were evidently seeking excitement and adventure. Sophie Pearce-Evans served as an ambulance driver and a motor dispatch rider with the WAAC from 1917 to 1919. She was born in Limerick in 1896, and she studied at the Royal College of Science in Dublin from 1914, so already unusual for her generation. In 1916, she married an English soldier. Initially, she continued her studies at the Royal College after her marriage, but in April 1917, she decided to join the WAAC. This allowed her to earn her own income for the first time, to join her husband in serving her country, and to exchange domestic life for a more adventurous one. According to her biographer, Lindy Naughton, the main attraction was to be embarking on her first adventure, unchaperoned and free to come and go as she wished, with no aunts or husbands to hold her back. At first, Sophie was based in England, where she carried messages for the army. She was later sent to France, where she worked with an ambulance unit. In a letter to Torch magazine, produced by the Royal College of Science in December 1917, she described her experience in England in glowing terms. "I enjoy every second of life here. It is no end of a rag. The officers get up dances for us about once a fortnight. The work here is pretty stiff, I admit, but there isn't one of us that would go back to civvy life without regret." While serving in France, she had a portrait painted by the Irish war artist Sir John Lavery, in July 1919, and that's the image that you can see here. The search for personal fulfillment and a desire for adventure and excitement motivated Sophie's war service, and this was a common motivator for war work. A significant number of the women who devoted their time to the war effort also had a family member served in the armed forces, and so may have provided some consolation to be able to contribute in some way themselves. Aoife Maher from Dublin, for example, joined the Red Cross. Her brother Edmund enlisted in the British Army, serving with the Munster Fusiliers. Aoife served in France and in Malta. She experienced a sense of pride and satisfaction from the payment she received for her work, describing it as the first money she ever earned. Although homesick, she was committed to her work and she signed up for further service in France after her initial stint in Malta, feeling that it was her duty to do so. Emma Duffin, a young middle-class Belfast woman, volunteered as a Red Cross nurse alongside her 4 sisters. Their brother was an officer in the British Army. In a letter to her mother in May 1915, Emma outlined her motives for volunteering. "I'm glad, for I think it is the right thing to do. You'll feel that you are being of some use. Makes me independent till the end of the war anyway, and I dare say I'll get to like the work. Everyone seems to. It will certainly be interesting." For a middle-class woman like herself, war service offered a way of breaking out of domestic space and a chance for more independence. The sense that being the right thing to do was very common as well, with many women feeling almost compelled to do something related to the war. Isabella Cleland from County Antrim inserted a note with her completed British Red Cross service record, outlining how she'd seen a call in a local newspaper for volunteers to help with the sphagnum moss dressings. She described how she was well pleased with the privilege of doing a little bit. She made estimated 3 dozen bandages every week for 18 months. The war's impact was felt beyond mobilisation, affecting women's household management, their family relations, their standard of living, their work conditions and opportunities. Women replaced absent men in the workforce. Although to a much less significant extent than Britain, Irish women took up new jobs in wartime and entered previously male-dominated professions in greater numbers, including the railway industry, the civil service, and the medical profession. Women also played an important role working in munitions factories in Ireland and in Britain. So munitions, which is, of course, producing weapons of war, ammunition, grenades, and shells, and so forth, was very well paid compared to domestic service and other traditional female employments. 5 national shell factories were established in Ireland, in Dublin, Galway, Waterford, and Cork, employing over 2,000 people, over 2/3 of whom were women. Private firms also gained munitions contracts from the War Office, including Keenox in Arklow, Pierce's in Wexford, and many more. It is estimated that in September 1915, there were nearly 100 factories of varying sizes engaged in manufacturing war munitions in Belfast alone. And while in September 1918, it was reported that close to 5,000 women were working in munitions in Belfast. One such factory was a textile machinery plant, James Mackey and Sons, known as Mackey's. Over the course of the war, the workforce more than doubled from the pre-war numbers of about 650. And the textile factory opened a munitions department in early September 1915, where they produced bombs and grenades, and they later opened a shell factory and an aircraft department. Most of the additional wartime staff were women, and their entry into the factory was described in a later institutional history as an invasion of women. According to this history, the misogynist reportedly bowed to the inevitable, and it was soon acknowledged that the hand that rocks a cradle could gauge a shell to a nigh infinitesimal fraction. And I should say this is a direct quote in relation to referring to them as misogynists. Many women were also coping with separation from their husband and attempting to manage the household alone in a time of rising inflation and food shortages. The cost of living doubled in Ireland over the course of the war, with its impact most felt in urban areas. The Catholic Bulletin noted the changes to wartime diet in October 1918. No breakfast bacon, margarine instead of butter, and sugar now doled out with a miserly hand. The deficiencies in diet were most felt by women due to the practice of men being fed first, and the need to ensure that the usually male primary wage earner had sufficient strength for work. These 2 cartoons from the magazine Irish Life illustrate the wartime conversations about food shortages. In the first, a woman is attempting to buy sugar after the introduction of sugar rationing in 1918. She forgot her ration card the first day, but there was no sugar left the following day. In the second, a doctor prescribes tablets to be taken with meals, and the patient asks, "Yes, but where shall I get the meal from?" The food shortages meant that careful household management became increasingly important in wartime. Campaigns regarding conservation of the food supply were aimed at women as guardians of the home. Propaganda posters, such as these ones, exhorted them to be careful not to waste food, claiming that through their power as household managers, they could shorten the war by avoiding waste and saving money. Wartime privation was not only an economic necessity, but a sign of patriotism and morality. In Ireland, as elsewhere in Europe, pre-war consumption patterns and indulgences were frowned upon even when affordable, and they were associated with the hated figure of the war profiteer. Calls for austerity, however, highlighted class divisions. The Catholic Bulletin noted that the wealthy could still indulge in many luxuries, while the poor cannot afford the bare necessities of life. Claiming that there was never more need for self-denial than the present, they argue that while self-denial was a sad necessity of the poor, it ought to be the proud duty of the leisured rich. And a couple of examples illustrate this disparity that was happening at the time. In 1915, a woman was thrown out of a recruitment meeting in Mayo when she interrupted the speaker to protest about the wartime inflation of the cost of a bag of flour. Around the same time, Rosamond Stephen, an upper-class woman living in Belfast, complained about the increased cost of hats and how the war had made it impossible to acquire good straw hats from Italy. In another Irish Life cartoon titled Wartime Economy, this time from 1916, a wife persuades her husband to give up his luxuries in wartime, and then eventually tells him that he can spend the savings on a new set of furs for her. Sir Matthew Nathan, the Undersecretary for Ireland from 1914 to 1916, so the representative of the British government in Ireland, asserted in December 1915 that there was much money in the country at the present time, and apart from the poor people, the community was well off. This rather tautological statement does not, however, make it clear just whom he was including in the category of poor people. For the upper classes, the war meant holidaying in Irish resorts rather than travelling overseas, while for others it meant destitution. Separation allowances, however, provided some financial compensation to the families of serving soldiers and sailors. In the United Kingdom and its dominions, the wives and children of all enlisted men received allowances, while other relatives could claim based on pre-war dependency. The majority of the Irish men who served in the wartime British Army would have had family in Ireland who received allowances. For many women, this pay represented their first regular income, and it has been suggested that they contributed to wartime improvements in health and standard of living. Although the allowances were paid in recognition of their husband's war service, the women collected their weekly money from the post office themselves, and they had control over the spending. For the families of men who were unemployed or working as casual labourers before the war, the money represented a real improvement in income, and for some was a motivation for the men to join the British Army in the first place. Paul Smith's fictionalised memoir of his mother, Mrs. Baines, describes the economic benefit of the separation allowance for working class families. Debts were paid and the arrears on the rent, as well as the insurance, so now that the constant threat for pauper's burial, if anything happened to herself or one of the children, was no longer a dread. For the first time since she'd married, she knew what it was to have a week's wages from him. Mrs. Baines' husband, an unskilled labourer, was a poor provider for his family before the war, spending most of his earnings on drink. And so the separation allowances were brought relief to the family and some sense of stability for the first time. The war brought greater state intervention into the lives of working class women, however, accompanied by social scrutiny and policing of women's behaviour. Anxiety about apparent increases in drunkenness among the wives of soldiers led to concern about how they were spending their separation allowances. There were also attempts to police the interactions between unmarried women and soldiers, prompted by concern about the spread of syphilis and the supposed increase in babies born out of wedlock. Private behaviour became a matter of public concern and subject of commentary and policing throughout the war. War also had a politicising impact, most evident in the participation of women in the Easter 1916 rebellion, An insurrection, of course, designed to take advantage of the wartime conditions, and which must be considered as a wartime event, and the 1918 anti-conscription campaign, both key events in Ireland's wartime experience. The politicising effects were similarly apparent in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, when women played an essential role in fundraising and propaganda for the Republican movement through organisations such as the Irish National Volunteer Dependents Association, but also in the actions of separation women, that is soldiers' wives, during the by-elections. And the middle image here, the Irish Party's only props in Longford, is referencing the participation of soldiers' wives as supporters of the Irish Parliamentary Party during the South Longford by-election in 1917. This complex political background makes the Irish case particularly interesting for exploring the mobilisation process and the diverse factors affecting women's war service. The need for remobilisation in the second half of the war in Ireland takes place not only in the context of the war weariness, which is prevalent all across Europe, but also in the aftermath of armed insurrection in Ireland's capital city. In my book, I highlight how societies became pulled into what Joanna Alberti describes as the vortex of war, despite domestic political crises and even without conscription, particularly high recruitment rates, or the experience of bombardment. The war can nevertheless have a transformative effect upon society and gender identities. The war ended with the signing of the Armistice on 11th November 1918. In her memoir, The Wandering Years, published in 1922, the writer Catherine Tynan described the moment of the announcement of the Armistice and its reaction in Ireland. The winter opened with festivities and dances, but before that there was the Armistice, the amazing, the incredible thing, so long prayed for and hoped for, that when the promise of it came, no one believed it. In an earlier memoir completed in April 1918, Tynan predicted that there would be no rejoicing when peace finally came. She wrote, "We'd suffer too much for that. We might emerge from underneath its scourges, but our backs would still be bloody." The reality was a mix of both joy and relief, and a sense of loss and deflation at all of those who did not survive to see the end. For those bereaved in particular, the ending of the war meant little, and indeed was a difficult time. Rosamond Stephen described a visit to her neighbour, Mrs. Rice, in Belfast, to tell her the news of the Armistice. She sat by the fire saying, "I'm glad, I'm very glad," and really she did not care 2 straws, because her Oni was killed in action, and Joe's in a lunatic asylum with shell shock. She was very fond of those 2 boys. Bereaved families felt their loss even more keenly when the war ended and other people's husbands and sons began to come home. Veronica Wayne from County Wicklow wrote to her mother in November 1918, that while the announcement of the Armistice was frightfully thrilling, one cannot help wanting their own boy badly. She was referring to her brother Charles, who died of wounds while serving in France in June 1917. Approximately 35,000 Irish men who enlisted from Ireland were killed in the war, leaving many thousands of devastated families behind. The telegram that you can see in the corner here came to Senta MacDonald in September 1918. She was managing the family farm in Drogheda when word came that her husband John had been killed in action in France, tantalisingly close to the end of the war. Her final letter to John, updating him on the activities of their 2 little children, was returned with his possessions. The couple had written to each other almost every day. Senta went to a lot of effort to try and learn more about the circumstances of her husband's death, and an ultimately unsuccessful effort to have his body returned home to Ireland for burial. She donated her papers to the National Library many decades later, and so this telegram that brought her such devastating news in September 1918 is in a folder in the National Library now, where I read it several years ago. Phyllis Kelly of Athlone had been bereaved in 1916 when her sweetheart Eric Appleby was killed in France. On learning that he was dangerously wounded, Phyllis wrote that surely God won't take you from me now. It'll be the end of everything that matters. But she received word of his death before the letter could be sent. Some women cannot cope with their wartime losses. Private Thomas Joyce was killed by a shell at the front in late 1915, and on 2nd of January 1916, his widow Mary Ellen Joyce drowned herself in a pond in County Leitrim. She left a note for her mother saying that she'd gone to Tommy. We promised each other we would follow one another. This was not an isolated case. Rosamund Stephen describes 2 suicides in her Belfast neighbourhood involving the mothers of soldiers, which was attributed to the women's anxiety over their sons in the trenches. And the image here that you can see of graves is one that I took on a visit to Gallipoli in Turkey in 2015, where, of course, many thousands of Irish men, most of them from Dublin, were killed in 1915. And so the images of that whole graveyard is just Irish graves. A very, very beautiful but very moving place. Although women's war service carried much less risk than that of men in the armed forces, at least 43 women from Ireland died on what was termed active service between 1914 and 1918, while another 13 died in 1919. Alongside professional and voluntary nurses, these included members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the Women's Legion, the Women's Royal Air Force, and the Women's Royal Naval Service. The dubious honour of being the only member of the Women's Royal Naval Service to die in the Great War due to enemy action goes to an Irish woman. Josephine Carr, pictured here, drowned in the sinking of the Leinster mailboat on 10th of October 1918. Born in Cork in 1899, she'd recently enlisted with the Wrens to work as a shorthand typist. She was travelling on the Leinster en route to England for Wren's work and was with 2 colleagues from Cork, Maureen Waters and Lillian Barry, who both survived the sinking. Maureen Waters recalled afterwards the moment of the torpedo collision. The ship was standing upright almost, propeller in the air. I prayed as I never did before. Carr's body, like so many of the casualties, was never recovered. She is, however, commemorated on the Women's Royal Naval Service Memorial in Plymouth. She is one of 10 Irish women on active service who died in the Leinster sinking, just a month before the Armistice. Among the 9 others was Claire McNally, a member of the Women's Legion, whose father had been killed earlier in the war while serving with the Connacht Rangers. Many of the women who died on active service are buried far from home, in England, France, Italy, Malta, Egypt, Palestine, and Salonika. 18 of the nursing casualties are commemorated in St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast, and you can see the plaque here, which lists them all. But many others are remembered in parish memorials or in graveyards scattered around Ireland. And these include a woman from Louth, Kathleen Carroll from Mulla Valley, who died in active service with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in July 1918, aged just 27. She's buried in Louth Old Graveyard. This is her grave here. And she was a daughter of Francis Carroll, who was a former Royal Irish Constabulary constable. Given that she was buried at home, it seems likely that she died from illness. But I haven't yet been able to find any further information on her. Some Irish women died after the war's end, but from illness contracted in overseas service. These include Aoife Maher, who I mentioned earlier. She died in April 1919 at home in Dublin. She's believed to have contracted tuberculosis while serving with the Red Cross in France. Her brother Edmund was killed in the war, and their father, bereft of the loss of his 2 children, organised for them both to be listed on the same memorial in St Mary's Church on Haddington Road in Dublin. Veronica Wayne was initially concerned about what the ending of the war meant for her wartime employment in the censor's office in London. Her letters to her mother displayed the uncertainty created by the Armistice. Mrs. Phil seems to think we might get a week's notice any time soon. I don't think anyone really knows. The work is stale and stifling, and I'm longing to paint and to write and still more to be home. It's long enough to be away when the war was on. So initially she was concerned about the loss of her job, but then she became enthused about the prospect of coming home, finding that the work held less fulfilment for her now that the war had ended. The sense of uncertainty and instability described by Veronica was common to many women war workers, for whom the Armistice had immediate economic impact. Although Veronica came from an upper-class family and had independent means, many working-class women faced unemployment and hardship in Ireland and Great Britain after the end of the war. Those working in munitions factories or employed in War Office contracts very quickly found themselves without work and with little prospect of new employment except in domestic service. Many workers in munitions factories in Dublin were laid off within a few weeks of the announcement of the Armistice. Unemployment was high in post-war Ireland, and men were given priority for whatever work was available. Many Irish women chose to emigrate to seek work, re-establishing the pre-war pattern of exceptionally high emigration from Ireland. Many of those who were active in the war effort returned to the domestic sphere and resumed their pre-war lives. Some remained active in philanthropic work. Emma Duffy became a member of the Belfast Council of Social Welfare Committee after the war, and during the Second World War, she served as commandant of the VAD unit at the Stranmillis Military Hospital in Belfast. Sophie Pearce-Evans became a keen athlete and one of the founders of the Women's Amateur Athletic Association. In 1926, she qualified as a private pilot and became the first woman in Ireland or Great Britain to obtain a commercial flying licence. Her first marriage fell apart, and she's better known by one of her later married names as Lady Mary Heat. Her biographer, Lindy Naughton, suggests that she craves the adventure and the danger offered by the war, and she spent the rest of her rather turbulent life attempting to relive those lost days of excitement and independence. Senta MacDonald married again some years after the war to another former soldier, but her only son from her first marriage, Robert Edward MacDonald, who was only about 3 years old when his father was killed, was himself killed in 1941 in World War II, serving with the British Army. Phyllis Kelly never married, and she kept a picture of her lost fiancé over her bed for the rest of her life. Reflecting on a war experience 2 decades later, the Donegal nurse, Catherine Black, was very aware of its significance in her life. She wondered how she endured the wartime years of nursing service in France, finding it only possible to reflect upon them at all from a distance of 20 years. She wrote in her memoir that, "You cannot go through the things we went through, see the things we saw, and remain the same. You went into it young and light-hearted. You came out older than any span of years could make you." Another Irish woman, the Countess Fingal, also described in her memoir the difficulty of adjusting to the post-war life and coping with the losses that her social circle had sustained. The world we had known had vanished. We hunted again, but ghosts rode with us. We sat at table, but there were absent faces. I want to talk very briefly now about my book, what I was attempting to do with it, and my approach to the research. I first became interested in this topic over 10 years ago when I was finishing up my undergrad in a Munitions University degree, Munitions University in 2011. And I quickly realised there'd been very little published on the experience of Irish women in the war, despite it being evident from my work on the study of the international context that gender was established as an important category of analysis in the international literature. The late historian Keith Jeffrey described the topic rather eloquently in his 2000 book, Ireland and the Great War, as a historically hidden Ireland. In a chapter in 2008, the historian Katrina Clear described women's war story as hidden in the shadows. Over the past decade, women have emerged from the historical shadow, and this book is part of that process of reclaiming this history and uncovering these stories. My aim was to offer a new lens for exploring the history of the First World War and the Irish Revolution, moving away from traditional political or military histories to focus on the lived experience of those who are attempting to go about their lives during a period of national and international turmoil. The book challenges existing narratives about the extent of the war's impact on Ireland and provides a new conceptual framework for understanding women's lives during this decade of change. Taking an all-island approach to the First World War period, it attempts to untangle the different meanings of the war for Irish people and to represent these diverse perspectives. There are great differences between urban and rural experiences, between North and South, sufficient that we can talk of plural home fronts. In Ireland, farming families prospered from increased demand for their produce, while price inflation and food shortages created grim conditions for urban dwellers. Those living in the towns and cities suffered from the war's impact the most, but they're also most likely to benefit from the expanded opportunities it generated. Munitions factories, home front positions in clerical work, army auxiliary service, and hospital nursing, these were primarily, although not exclusively, clustered in the towns. The majority Protestant population in Ulster carved out their own experience. War service became an opportunity to prove their loyalty to Britain and to the Empire, but also to create further distance from the South. Whether war meant emancipation for women or the extent to which voluntary mobilisation was affected by class, the pre-war circumstances of family, and the women's domestic responsibilities. We must consider how women themselves viewed their wartime experience and what it meant to them at the time. In this book, I've attempted to grapple with the issue identified by the historian J. Winter in his pioneering work, The Great War and the British People. War can bring quantitative structural benefits to people's standard of living or their employment prospects, but can nevertheless be experienced as a monumental disaster by those who lived through it. So for some women, they might have gained employment opportunities that would never have been available to them previously, but nonetheless, they experience the war as a period of suffering and difficulty. Returning the focus to lived experience can help us to see the gritty realities of war and gain a stronger understanding of what it actually meant for women in Ireland and how this might compare to other combatant countries. This experience of women's lives is pieced together using a diverse range of primary sources, drawn from over 20 archives and libraries in Ireland and the United Kingdom. It also makes use of 40 contemporary newspapers and periodicals to assist with this history from below approach. I made particularly extensive use of the Lady of the House magazine and the Irish Citizen, which is Ireland's suffrage newspaper. I also used sampling methods to examine the experience of war workers, drawn on the membership records of Irish women who served with the British Red Cross or the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, using the 1911 census to uncover more about these women's backgrounds. Uncovering the individual experience is important, and the book draws upon diaries, personal correspondence, and memoirs. However, adult literacy levels were exceptionally high and roughly equal among men and women in Ireland by 1914, but there are nonetheless relatively few surviving personal accounts of domestic and social life on the Irish home front. This is influenced by the lack of academic and popular interest in Irish participation in the Great War until the 1980s, which meant that items of historic value relating to the war were less likely to be valued or donated to public bodies, and there's much fewer oral history accounts. Women's voices, however, are also underrepresented in the archives, which is an issue evident beyond Ireland. The British historians Alison Fell and Lucy Noakes have observed that the prioritisation of the male combatant experience resulted in the memorialisation of fewer first-hand accounts of grief or coping with family, work, and shortages of food and fuel in wartime. Nevertheless, I have been able to piece together the stories of many Irish women whose lives were affected by the war. These include Isabella Clarke, who left her home in Belfast at age 16 to work in munitions factories in England, Marie Martin and Isa Mahoney, who served in voluntary nursing roles with the Red Cross in France and Malta, Letitia Overend, who played an important leadership role with the Wartime St. John Ambulance Association and the Irish Wartime War Hospital Supply Depot. I've also attempted to find the voices of those who remained at home, the mothers, wives, and sisters of soldiers. Emily Shirley, who busied herself with charitable work in Monaghan while waiting for her son to return home, but who herself passes away in 1918. Santa MacDonald, who kept the family farm going in her husband's absence and wrote to tell him about the new puppy and how proud he would be of their children, only for the letter to be returned with her husband's possessions when he died before the war ended. Mary Martin, who kept a diary for 6 months in 1916, so that her son Charlie, reported missing in Gallipoli, might be brought up to date on all that he had missed. Immersing myself in these diaries, letters, and memoirs of women such as these was a moving experience, and I hope that I've succeeded in giving readers some insight into these women's stories, and that the book can shed light on aspects of our history that have often been ignored or forgotten. In July 1918, the Church of Ireland Gazette reflected in an article titled The Modern Girl on the women's emancipation movement, arguing that its fruits had ripened. The characteristic of the modern girl is the assertion of her independence, politically, economically, and spiritually. Women in Ireland, as in other combatant countries, have participated in the war effort, with their roles ranging from manager of the family budget to nursing wounded soldiers to producing weapons of war. Many gained new confidence and took advantage of the wartime opportunities to enter different areas of employment, even if just for the duration. However, for many, the war was a time of hardship and suffering with bereavement and loss among the common experiences on the home front. I've attempted to tell the stories of these women, and by doing so, to offer a new perspective on the history of Ireland in the 20th century. Thank you for listening.
Right, thank you, Fionnuala, for that talk. That was fascinating stuff. Well, I was going to ask you about the international literature, but then you ruined that by covering it in the talk. So what I'm actually going to say, what I'd actually kind of come back to what you were saying about the production of the book, and just say, how useful was that international literature for you in terms of kind of providing frames of reference, let's say, the term?
Yeah, so it really was essential. And in a way, it was very helpful for me to start working on a topic that, although, hadn't been looked at very much in Ireland, there was this vast material on from other countries. So, for example, like in Britain, there are several books devoted to women's lives during the First World War, and various different aspects of that. There's entire books about, women and work, nursing during the war, home front experiences, and so forth. And so I also looked at material on Canada and Australia, France, Germany, and Italy, and so forth. And what this meant was that this gave me a set of questions to look for in the Irish case, a sort of a hypothesis, and a sense of, a framework in a way for what I was going to be doing. And, some guidance in terms of, well, these are the sorts of sources that might be useful that have been used in a British case or in a French case. Do we have these sources in Ireland? Now, in some cases, it simply wasn't possible, or the differences were so great between the Irish experience and elsewhere that, it wasn't applicable. But even that in itself, so for example, one of the great differences between Ireland and Britain is the fact that conscription is implemented in Britain in 1916, but isn't implemented in Ireland due to the political climate. And so conscription has a massive impact on women, because then they're forced into the workforce and do so much greater numbers. So what I was interested in, if you take out the equation of conscription, is it possible for women and work to be a wartime experience in Ireland? What does that, mean? What does absence, in a sense, mean in Ireland? And, there's also this whole debate within the British literature and literature from other countries about, does the war mean emancipation? Is it a watershed moment for women's rights? To what extent is it rolled back at the end of the war? This is all something that's been discussed since the 1970s, when women's history really developed outside Ireland. And so, I could engage with all of this material and benefit from all that had been written previously, and to attempt to situate what I was looking at within this wider international framework.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. We've had a question in from, this is from our moderator here, Barry, who's just wondering that when you were delving into the diaries you referred to, it may have been kind of harrowing, etc. And was there any, was it difficult reading at some point? And were there any in particular that stood out?
Yeah, it certainly was. Like one, the Santa MacDonald, case so there's the whole set of folders in the National Library with the letters from, so it's the letter, not her letters to him don't survive, except for in one individual case, but his letters to her are all there. And so you're reading them, and you really get involved in these people's lives, and it's he sends like little drawings of like airplanes and stuff for like the little boy. And it's very much domestic talk all the time. And then you open up, I think folder number 8, I think it might be, and then the telegram is just sitting there right in front of you. And it just all, and the next thing is the letter that she wrote to him that gets returned afterwards. And it's the first time you come across her voice. And it's just this innocent letter saying, oh, we got a puppy. Father says I'm looking after the farm very well. The children are fine, and it's just so sad knowing, putting that in the context of telegram, and all the rest of the letters are all about, what her trying to find out about how he died and his body and so forth. And then, of course, I looked up the family to try and discover a little bit more, and found out about the son dying in World War II. And that just seemed like, far too much. Yeah. Another slightly different one was, I was looking at the diary of Emily Shirley, who was a woman in County Monaghan. Her diary is in the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland. She keeps a really detailed diary, so writing it almost every day about activities locally. So and so comes home on leave. Her and her deep anxiety about her son, and her worry that he might not make it home. And she mentions her health a few times, but, it's not really a big thing. And then suddenly the diary just stops in April 1918. And as, why did she stop writing? Looked her up, discovered that she had passed away in April 1918, before her son came home, before the war ended. And it just seemed so terribly sad that, she spent those 4 years anxiously watching the war and waiting, and then doesn't quite make it. So I certainly, I got very invested in some of these women and following their lives. And there's something, about reading handwritten accounts, or, me just, that sort of division perhaps, that's often there of historical research, kind of gets blurred, and they become quite personal in a way to you.
Yeah, okay, thanks. The other question we had here was, did you come across anyone who, this maybe moving into the revolutionary period, did you come across any reprisals on women who participated in the war effort or anything like that? I mean, I have a related question, which I might just put to you first, was, did you see any example of women regretting their war service, either with reference kind of to politics or just in general? I mean, often you see, the narratives about male soldiers is often, modernized. We often look at it saying, the trauma and PTSD and everything. But again, very often when you read the soldiers' accounts, they say they do it all again. So, I mean, do you see any sense of regret? And was there any reprisals, or any of them run into difficulty during the revolutionary period?
Yeah, interesting questions. In terms of the regret, so I've come across a few examples of women who were involved in the war effort in 1914, 1915, and who later ended up quite active in their Republican movement, right, in the Easter Rising and afterwards. And so in their Bureau military history accounts or memoirs, they say, oh, I was involved in this, nursing or whatever it was. But then I realized what was, my mistake, and I realized, my true position in relation to Ireland. And I, stopped supporting the British Army soldiers. And so but they used it as sort of moment of, awakening, that I was young and naive and did not know what I was, doing. And then I became a true radical Republican. And, it's always difficult to, these are something that's written much later, in a way, just to find, their change over time. And so, there's a spin on it, which, they might not themselves know how they felt about it. In terms of women, there's some women who were disabled from war service, who, are seeking disability pensions, decades afterwards and so forth. But I haven't come across any that explicitly say, oh, I wish I hadn't been involved in that. Though, I'd say some of them did end up with their health damaged forever. So, but it does they still see it as, something positive in the sense that they were involved in. Now, there are some, though, who did, there's some who end up in difficulties afterwards. So in terms of reprisals, women, there was attacks on women for walking out with soldiers, right, during the war, and afterwards particularly. So this is where, some of the instances of hair cutting, and tarring and feathering and so forth come into play. And some of that does begin to happen during the war itself. I've come across a woman who served with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, who was attacked in, I think it's in Dublin, on her after the war ends, and she's assaulted. And she says that the reason that he assaulted her was because he thought that, as I think he's trying to sexually assault her, and he says that, as somebody that she's not, as a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps person, that she is immoral anyway, and that she, should have been up for it, basically. And so she writes, she's looking for support from the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps organization, and saying that she's been suffering because of her support for king and country. So she is directly linking the assault to her service with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and saying that it's making it very difficult for her to survive in Ireland and to get work. There's others who emigrate afterwards and say it's because of the hostility that they experienced in Ireland. this obviously comes into play with then, generally with Southern loyalists and so forth. So, some of these are Protestant, some of these are from, it's sometimes difficult to, is it the war service that makes them the target, or is it other sort of community identifiers? We have some examples of meetings being, Red Cross meetings being disrupted by Sinn Féin supporters, the separation women soldiers' wives who actively support the Irish Parliamentary Party during the by-elections from 1917 to 1918. There's a lot of violent opposition to them, but they also engage in violent behaviour. So, it's very much an old sides thing. So yeah, it's in terms of, there's certainly, I think there's more to be done about the post-war atmosphere, about how women feel about what they did, and how they, what I'm interested in a little bit at the moment is sort of on that trauma of women coming home and adjusting to peacetime afterwards. But I say, isolated incidents of attacks and reprisals and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, just on what you say there about more to be done, that's something I've found in doing some research for this role, and that when you go through the local papers, which is something I used relatively little in my earlier research, you come across the whole rich story of things like, accounts of markets and prices and local sanitation, everything that we actually have very relatively little done. We don't even really have kind of what you might call like say what you've done with women in the Great War. We don't even have a textbook to tell us what was life like for a housewife going to market, and what does it mean if the spuds are whatever in Dundalk in
absolutely
August 1920.
Yeah. Well, that's some stuff I hope to write actually next. But no, there is just still so much to be done, and so much, I think so there's a great benefit to local history and to local history works and close analysis of the newspapers and records and so forth. And I think that can offer a huge amount. But then it's relating it to the national picture and these forecourt series at the moment, history of each county during the Revolution period. I think when we have all of those complete, I think that'll be very helpful for us in the sense of piecing all of this together. But I just keep finding more and more stuff. I'm thinking, that would have been great to put that into the book. But there's no end to the research that can be done, and even today, I found some more material. So that's the joy of it, I suppose.
Yeah, it's one way of putting it. Yeah, I just actually think your point there about the auxiliary corps and the kind of the Sinn Féin supporter kind of perception of it, and that was something I wanted to ask you. Was there any sense of some families discouraging women's participation in things like the auxiliary corps, or going to work as a nurse in France because of they're afraid of what they might see if they go, and that goes to everything, not just they might see horrible wounds and stuff, but they'll be in a kind of a very, the Western Front would be a very male environment, and any account, fictional or memoirs, kind of would confirm that, I think. So there's thousands upon thousands of men around there. Is there any sense of particularly female relatives wanting to hold women back from volunteering as nurses for that reason, or did you come across something like that?
Yeah, certainly there's some hesitation, and certainly some sense of families having a preference for women working in auxiliary hospitals on the home front, right? So hospitals that would have cared for convalescent soldiers, as opposed to the work done closer to the front in casualty clearing stations, where things were a lot more dangerous. The risk of being bombed, but also a lot more gory, unpleasant, difficult, challenging. And so there is, and some, in some cases, women were called back home, because family domestic responsibilities as well. So them choosing to go overseas for a full-time period, did not always fit with their family expectations of what they could do. And certainly with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in particular, there was general concern about their them taking on slightly less traditional roles, them wearing, sort of military uniform, although, a feminized military uniform, and their interactions with the soldiers. And there is a sexual immorality scandal relation, that takes place in France, claims that from some of them, from the soldiers, that the women are getting up to no good. I did a sample of 75 women from Ireland who served with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. In that sample of 75 women, there were a few that were dismissed for misbehavior, and one that was dismissed because she was pregnant, and she was unmarried at the time. And the dates would suggest that she became pregnant while serving with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And these are just random examples that happened to come up in my sample. And so there was concern about the moral character of the women, as well as the influence of their service. And even, Emma Duffin, her and her sisters, they're middle-class women from very respectable Belfast family. They're writing letters to their mother and to each other throughout the war. And they themselves are quite conscious about the class of the women that they are associating with. It's not just the soldiers, but also their fellow volunteers. And there's kind of distinction, the Red Cross women versus the St. John Ambulance women. There's no good reason why there would be a distinction, but, one of them, Celia, writes to her mother that a lot of the St. Red Cross girls are ladies, but the St. John Ambulance ones are not. And it's this distinction between ladies and women, and a sense of, are these suitable people for me to be associating with? So, there's certainly concerns about the level of freedom given to them, and also the types of people who they might be associating with. But of course, some of this is the attraction for the young women themselves, trying to break down those boundaries,
Yeah. With a question in, was there a sectarian difference in the enlistment of Catholic and Protestant women into the various organizations? Was there a difference in the roles they took on, and then maybe a number crunching difference, so to speak?
Yeah. So, in my analysis of Red Cross records, which is a sample, so I took over 200 women who were just direct volunteers in the Red Cross, sort of every 10th record that could be identified in 1911 census, and of those, the majority were Protestant, but a sizable minority were Catholic. And I did a sample then I took as many of the leaders of the detachments as I could find. And the majority of those were Protestant, and a higher percentage. And so it did seem like their Protestants tended to be in leadership positions within these, because these are all local branches, and so they tend to be the local big house, woman and so forth. And often, they have a leadership. They might be the commandant or something, but there's actually some other people who are doing the majority of the work. Sometimes women who work directly for these women in the big houses. There does seem to be, some proportionally there should be more Catholics. Looking at the population at the time. But there is slightly more Protestants. And this again does fit the rates of participation. Protestants are disproportionately represented in the British Army at the time. More Catholics overall, but proportionally more Protestants. And it's also due to high rates of take up in Ulster, where people who'd been involved with the Ulster volunteer force and its female detachments before the war then converted into war work. With the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, from what I found, it's a bit more equal. Very similar numbers of Protestants and Catholics, and there's a class difference there because it's paid work. So it attracts a broader range. And there is some, there's concern about the organizations leading it. So there's the Catholic Church in Ireland are supportive of women doing this sort of thing, but they want them to do it as Catholics. They want them to do it in organizations linked to other Catholics. There's concern, about mixing, basically. And this is particularly evident when it comes to Belgian refugees who arrive in Ireland in 1915 and are housed here for the duration. And so women are very involved in, supporting these refugees, finding them places to live and employment and all this sort of thing, organising social events for them. But the refugees are predominantly Catholic, and there's a lot of concern about Anglican women potentially engaging in what's called proselytism, so attempting to convert the refugees. And so this is what really concerns Archbishop William Walsh at the time of the war, is about the potential risks of war work in terms of Protestants and Catholics mixing together too much, and poor Catholic Belgian refugees being influenced by Protestants. There's a big scandal in Portadown at one stage, and people have to be moved and everything. So, politics, religion, and class all continue to be really important factors throughout the war. And this is not, just as it is in the trenches, this is not a case of everybody meeting and saying, oh, we forget all of our differences. Those differences are, acute, and they become more acute, in terms of politics, particularly after 1916. And all of that is evident in people's experiences, and they're using people are using war service for their own agenda as well, and it's been used to either support unionism or loyalism, or also Catholic support of the war effort, specifically to prove that Catholics were involved. So there's lots of different elements to all of this.
Yeah, that's interesting what you say there, because I do know that in Britain, I think even in Scotland, I think it's true that the Catholic Church seemed very concerned to look after the Belgian refugees as a kind of a Catholic, almost Catholic solidarity, for want of a better term, to help you. So it's interesting that that's going on in Ireland as well. Just, did you find any women trying to enlist in the Indian civil service, or I suppose any most of the presentation was talked about kind of gendered roles for women. Were any women trying to break down more into more white collar, break down barriers in the kind of white collar realm, if you want to say, use that term, during the period, because the men were away?
So I haven't found anything specifically about the Indian civil service. I'm not sure that would have been open to women at the time. But I admit it's something I didn't come across, and I haven't looked for, I suppose. But generally, in terms of the civil service, so the war generates bureaucracy and paperwork. Okay, and so there's more work available, and more spaces for women to enter into that. And so the total numbers of women working in the civil service in Ireland remain quite small, but it's nonetheless a significant increase on 1914. And so there's new possibilities for them to open up, many of them into like army pay offices, but also lots of different departments employ women for the first time. Now, the interesting thing is, though, in 1916, the British government decides to do a survey of all of these government departments in Britain and Ireland to see how do they feel about employing women, and would they be willing to do it after the war ends. So this is in 1916. We only had women in there for a couple of years, still a novelty. And almost all of the Irish government departments say they don't want to continue with it, and that it's okay for the war, but it's not something that's sustainable in the long run. They cite various reasons, the usual stuff you might expect. Women leave early to get married, disrupt service. These jobs need to be given to men who are breadwinners for their families, but also stuff like the fact that there isn't suitable office space. So at the time when women do work in offices and white collar work, they're not expected to share offices with men. This is seen as being poor for discipline, and it's not something that can be tolerated in any significant level. So it's seen as just, a lot of hassle to try and have workspaces that work for both men and women. And also then some work is considered unsuitable for women. And it's particularly the case in relation to police work, for example, like, office work, but for the police and so forth. So there's quite a lot of stuff that, say, yeah, thanks very much. We're glad to have you here right now in our hour of need. But as soon as it all ends, please go back to your homes. And, in most cases, this is what happens. And this even happens, with the medical profession. Obviously women take, new roles as nurses, but they also, there's a much higher percentage of female medical students at the time. And there's opportunities for promotion for women doctors that wouldn't be there normally. But even in those cases, it said at the time, this is for the war only, and this is not to be taken as precedent. And when the war ends, they say, oh, we've got an awful lot of extra women, women doctors, and they want them actually to go to India, because that's seen as like a way of getting rid of them, but also, keeping the good jobs for the men. And so, again, it's seen as like, thank you very much for your service, but, also please go away now. So yeah, it is all very much like, even at the time, not seen to be something lasting.
And what's the international picture there? I know just from your own reading, more so than your research, is that a common thing throughout the world? Is that you said the Irish government, when they're surveyed, is that a common, say, the Indian civil servants, or colonial service, or even in other countries?
Yeah. Response to the survey very similar in Britain. Similar, legislation brought in, restoration of pre-war practices and so forth. To legally kick women out of the workforce, and similar efforts to to make clear that this was something temporary. And this is very much the case, in other European countries at the time as well. And it's really seen as, not something to be accepted as a lasting change. Now, it's, some women do manage to cling on, and they manage to stay in their roles and to get experiences and opportunities that do, contribute to, significant careers for them. But, they are kind of the exception in a way.
Yeah, I think that's just some fictionalized accounts. I think that's something I've come across, just general reading. You often see a woman who's taken on a role who then becomes, a character in a novel or something, who then becomes quite senior, but they're obviously exceptional. I just one general point I'd make, and I wondered if you'd any thoughts on it. It's interesting the way that this legislation to push women back out of the workforce comes at a time when we see women being given the vote for the first time, and women's franchise expanding a lot across Europe. And do you have any thoughts on why there isn't more pushback on that, say, politically? I mean, is it an organizational thing, or?
Yeah, well, like women getting the vote, in 1918, women aged over 30, fulfilling certain property requirements and so forth. That is seen, for two reasons. Like, it's because they need to expand the franchise to include all soldiers. And so it's taking place in that context. And then, it's also a sort of, in Britain, a sort of thank you for your service in the war. And thank you for stopping your suffrage campaign, basically, for the duration. And, Irish women kind of get it almost by, as part of that process. Obviously, it's deliberately done unequally. So to make sure that the electorate has substantially more men, despite the wartime losses. That's why there's a separate age difference for men and women. And so, what it means basically in Ireland is that 1918, women get the vote. To some celebrations, this is seen, to some positive talk, but because it's limited, because it's not exactly what they're fighting for, and because it's coming from the British government at that stage, the response is quite muted, but it means that this movement kind of splinters. It's saying we need to keep fighting for equality, and of course in the 1922 Constitution, all women over the age of 21 get the vote on the same grounds as men. So 6 years ahead of women in Northern Ireland or Britain. But the sort of feminist, suffrage movement was always about far more than just the vote, right? And it unified women from a whole diverse range of political, religious, economic backgrounds. But the only thing that really unified them was looking for the vote. Okay, you take that away in 1918, even when there's still so much to fight for in the wider feminist movement, and they just splinter. They just can't pull it together anymore. There's just too much else, political differences and political turmoil and so forth. And so some of them end up becoming very conservative, sort of women's morality organizations. Others remain radical, people like Hannah She Skeffington, for example. But the women's feminist movement, it really is quite small and isn't getting, an awful lot of coverage. And, some historians link this to the treaty and the Civil War, and, prominent women being on the anti-treaty side during the Civil War, and just the impact of all of that. But what it does mean is that, so women in Ireland face both some immediate legislation under the British state, that restoration of pre-war practices and so forth, that pushed them back into domestic spaces, but also in the 1920s and 1930s under the Irish Free State. Various legislation is brought in, including the Marriage Bar, Conditions of Employment Act, various different things that again serve to push women back into domestic spaces and to roll back any wartime gains. And so, in a way, suffrage is almost kind of a false victory in a sense. It's this moment of, things coming together. But it's also, in a way, the ending of a really powerful, strong feminist movement that doesn't really surface again for several decades.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one thing I always think is really underdone in the history of the War of Independence in particular is the local government act. And that's somewhere where women do play a role, because actually what happens is a lot of the men are either interned or on the run, and so they can't attend meetings. So then it falls, like say in Dublin City Council, it falls to Hannah Sheedy Skeffington to essentially be the Sinn Féin voice on the council at the time. I just wonder as well, is there anything in I know there's a feeling in European history, say particularly in Germany and Spain, that practicing Catholic women, if you want to use that term, are quite a conservative force when they get the vote. Is there any sense of that being something, a dynamic at play in Ireland, or what's your sense of that?
Yeah, like there's different groups, I suppose, claim that women, are voting for them in the elections, 1918, 1920, and so forth. There certainly is a high proportion of conservative Catholic women, conservative Anglican women as well, at that time who, like the dominant view at the time among men and women was of a traditional place for, traditional, separate spheres for men and women, and so, people like Hannah Sheedy Skeffington, Louis Bennett, some of these others, like they really are anomalies in their own lifetime. And, even the suffrage movement, let's say most of it were not radicals. So, we are more familiar with in our history with the women who supported Sinn Féin, the activists, the Constance Markovics, the Jenny Weiss Power, all of these women who were very active. But the extent to which they represent the majority at the time, is always the difficult thing. Now, so, from newspapers at the time, Sinn Féin certainly claimed that women, helped to swing the 1918 election for them, and that they're voting in large numbers for Sinn Féin. But, the secrecy of the ballot box means that, all we know is what women themselves said afterwards, or, what was seen at the time. So, this is something that historians are continuing to work on. Elaine Callanan has done really interesting work on those elections, and including looking at the role of women voters. But it's a sort of complicated issue. And I suppose it does serve to remind us that, women are not an homogeneous identity at this time. I write a book titled Irish Women and the Great War, but there's no one type of Irish woman at this time, it just as we might have a book, Irish Men and the Great War, who exactly are those men, who are we talking about? And so, all of them have very different responses to the events that they're living through at the time. And we have to really bear that in mind as we read these sources.
Yeah, I mean, I do think to some degree there's probably a grain of truth in Sinn Féin's claim at the time. Actually, both iterations of Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin in 1918 and 1923, because, and I'll let you react to this. This would be my thinking on it, is that both times in both elections we see a massive jump kind of towards the Republican or greener aspect than we had in the previous election. So obviously, it's the collapse of the Irish Parliamentary Party in 1918, and then in 1923, the anti-treatyites do a lot better than anyone was expecting. And on both of those occasions, we see one side with the predominant a much larger number of female voices than the other. And we know in 1923, women did a lot of the campaigning for the Republican side. And then we see that the expansion of the franchise seems to have greatly increased the support for that side. So, I wonder what you think of my slightly shaky theory.
Yeah, no, like there's certainly, I say there's some evidence for it, and certainly it's, it's what's claimed by Sinn Féin at the time. Now, we do have to remember that, like, from 1918, the previous general election was 1910, I think, and so the electorate, like, the franchise isn't just expanding by nature of women, right? So it's massive expansion in the number of men as well who can vote at that time. So so many seats in the 1910 election, weren't contested. So it's really like it's very difficult to compare 1918 really with anything prior to it, because it's just a completely different system in a way, a completely different franchise. But certainly, the Irish Parliamentary Party had lost women's support by 1918, right? Obviously they kept some of these wives of soldiers and so forth, but they'd been quite hostile towards women's suffrage. They hadn't really made any great effort to court women voters. Well, Sinn Féin, from the moment women got the vote in February 1918, they were out there, training women in how to vote, advising them on how to do it, making sure that they got to the polling stations, that they learned, that they got on the register. Like they had voting drives, they're very active in. Now, the Ulster Unionist women did something similar, so the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, they mobilized as well, and they, to get their female vote out, even though they didn't necessarily believe in women's suffrage. They, wanted to make use of it for their own ends. So, there is, in a way, it seems logical that, Sinn Féin, of course, had supported women's suffrage. If it was part of their sort of campaign, when they adopted sort of the Easter Rising as their, as a moment that they subsequently came to have been part of. Easter Rising, of course, was a radical document of its time. The proclamation in terms of pledging women's suffrage, universal suffrage for all its men and women. Something we take for granted now, but which, was radical for its time, which is why it ends up in the 1922 Constitution, harking back to that moment. And so, these are like the feminist women of the time were almost all Sinn Féin people. So it makes logical sense that women would have supported them in the election in high numbers. But I'd say, it's that silent, majority in the middle, or people who might support Sinn Féin in an election, but, still are on the more conservative side of Sinn Féin, perhaps, in terms of how they see women's place in the world and a sort of society that they're imagining for independent Ireland.
Yeah, I suppose there's another problem in that the type of women we suspect voted for Sinn Féin are also the type of women who leave less source material behind.
Yeah, so this is something one has to really bear in mind while thinking about any of this sort of history, is how much is influenced by the source material that survives. And I mentioned in my paper some of the difficulties accessing sources, and some of the problems with the fact that First World War studies in Ireland really only took off in the late 1980s, and very much so in this century. The stuff that's simply, for Britain, we have oral history testimonies, in the Imperial War Museum, that were done in the 1950s, 1960s, really extensive ones. There was calls out for people to donate material to libraries, to archives. This has happened in Ireland in the last 10 years, which is too late,
Yeah.
Like more material is becoming into public domain all the time, which is super. But so much has been lost over the years. And so, we have to kind of bear in mind to what extent we are biased and skewed by the source material that we read, who leaves records behind, we've all this wonderful material now for the Irish Revolution, the Bureau of Military History, military service pensions, And this helping to balance the fact that previously, the British records were so much greater, and we could end up reading the British side because they had such great material, all nicely catalogued in queue for us. But now we are ending up in a situation perhaps where we are privileging Republican voices in these that are maybe perhaps giving us a sense that this is a dominant voice at the time. And again, we're leaving out, all the people who didn't really care that much, who are just trying to get on with their lives at the time. And so it is that thing of trying to, think about the gaps and the absences in what you're looking at, and what voices are being heard and what we're talking about here. And as I say, when one begins this research at 100 years distance, there's stuff that is irretrievably lost.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the comments our moderator Barry was making there in the comments about stuff that we've lost. Deirdre Moore says, thank you, Fionnuala, for such an interesting lecture, an eye-opener. Great that women's experience and contribution is being recognised. Sheena McHugh, who's joining us from Achill, I think. Thank you, Fionnuala. Great insight into a little-known subject. Teresa Quinn, thanks, Fionnuala. Thanks, Fionnuala. So fascinating and so much unknown here before. What a huge contribution Irish women made in World War I. And Elaine Barron says, a very interesting talk. Thank you. Brenda Barron says, thank you, Fionnuala, for a very interesting presentation. Trish McCarthy says, great lecture. Thanks so much. Important that whatever family archives survive relating to women are donated to a public archive to fill in the story. I'm sure you'd echo that.
Very good point. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to finish. We have another question from the host here. During your research, did you meet other academics who had good sources and documents on the role of women but did not include it in their own research?
Yeah, certainly. So my PhD research was supervised by David Fitzpatrick, one of Ireland's foremost historians of 19th to 20th century Ireland. And he had done extensive research on Ireland in the First World War. He was one of the pioneers of all of that, teaching the first courses on it in the 1980s. And David had published extensively on the topic, some really useful social and economic studies, as well as studies of military recruitment and so forth. But he'd also looked at far more than he'd ever published, and was aware of so much material out there and had some of it on record cards and, in shoeboxes in his office. And so, I would say, oh, I found this new exciting thing. And he'd say, oh, yes, I looked at that 10 years ago. But, it was great because he would then, send me off, give me ideas for stuff to look at and some sense of what was out there. And, he firmly believed when I started that this research was possible and that there was plenty of material out there that could be found and could be located. While many others who I spoke to in the initial days sort of said, I'm not sure there's a PhD topic in that, women didn't do very much. Perhaps you mean women on the Easter Rising or something. It's not really, a thing in itself. And then, plenty of others who worked around the topic, but who hadn't, weren't interested in women. And so who perhaps say, oh, yeah, I think there might be something there, but, that I didn't bother writing it down. But who, subsequently, got converted to the cause. So, I think in a way I benefited from coming in a way, as sort of later generation to this scholarship. At a time when there was, when I started working in this area in 2011, there was just, by the time I finished the PhD in 2015 and finished the book in 2019, so much had changed, by 2019 especially. And there was just a really active, vibrant community of scholars working in the area and sharing material. Let's see, a few people here have mentioned Kevin Myers, who was a really important figure in raising awareness about all of this area and doing some really important pioneering work, again, from the 1980s onwards. And so, but, there was really a few figures: Kevin Myers, Miles Dungan, David Fitzpatrick, Keith Jeffrey, John Horn to some degree. And, in recent, years, there's just been a real, I couldn't list them all now, which is good. There's been a really complete transformation in terms of the level of interest and the acceptance of the field within the academy, and the acceptance then of women's history within that discipline. First World War studies being a heavily male-dominated field until relatively recent times. So certainly I've benefited greatly from many of the scholars who've come before me, and many of them have been personally very supportive to me as I've undertaken this research.
That's great. Niamh Casey says, thanks, Fionnuala, really enjoyable and informative. I've actually a question since my dad raised Kevin Myers. It's a nice one. Was there much when you went to it, you're talking about people not really being aware. Was when the First World War became more into the popular realm, has there been much discussion or much interest, do you find, from kind of outside, say, the narrow confines of people who are interested in history? So people, say, who would attend a talk like this. So just more generally, do you notice stuff in the newspapers about, say, individual women, say, people, say, some of your own subjects, and do you find, how do you think all of that has
it certainly is. I think, getting into public domain, a bit more. And, for our Armistice Day, there's been, stuff specifically about it. And, in 2018, the Irish Times specifically sought a piece on women who died during the war. And, there's been, I guess, efforts to include it and to provide it to a more wider public audience. Now, that said, when I keep getting reminded of the limits of sort of public outreach and so forth, when I teach my own undergrads in UCD, and, I teach courses in all of these areas, and I sort of go in now expecting the students to be familiar with a lot of these areas already, because I feel like they are, so much in the public domain, and of course the students aren't. And I say to them, oh, do you remember the centenary of the First World War, like perhaps in 2014 or 2018? And now, of course, my undergrads were in school during that time. And they go sort of vaguely, maybe, and ask them, do you remember the centenary 2016 of the Easter Rising? And they, look even more vague. And I think this is, a really useful reminder to us that we tend to talk to similar groups, there's a lot of talking among ourselves. We do public outreach events like this, which are really wonderful. But we're talking to, the interested public, people who have an interest, in history and who want to know more. And, there's so much that perhaps isn't, people who aren't being engaged by this and who still, are repeating similar sort of sentiments to me that I might have encountered in 2011. So, obviously by the time they finish, a course with me, they have very different views. And, they know that women are central to history and that the First World War is central to Irish history. But, that is not something that we can necessarily still take for granted, I think.
Okay, good. Maria Murphy has said, thanks for a fascinating talk. And Deirdre Moore has just commented on how lucky we are to have libraries and archives we can delve into and enjoy and for free as well, which
absolutely.
I think, so say all of us. I do think the only controversy I ever really got engagement from public one was, and it may have been because it was actually going on at the time, but I was teaching tutorials in UCD during our Irish history tutorials during the RIC gate situation. In that case, and a lot of people may have been that it may be that they don't so much remember them as they go on, but maybe that's a factor. But that's certainly, I got a lot of
no, I was teaching the Irish Revolution at the time of that, and that was one of the things they were certainly aware of and generated interesting class discussions, which was a bit of a relief, I think. that some things do percolate.
Somebody's listening. So I have a really broad question, which is a bit just to finish off, which is it's not really a stinker. I don't think it's just a general question outside your research, but just to give us a thought on it. And to what extent, given your own knowledge on the First World War and your reading, to what extent do you think Ireland's neutrality and, say, lesser involvement in the Second World War might have affected the status of Irish women during the 50s and early 60s. Do you have any thoughts on that to finish up?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah, so obviously the Second World War is treated, many historians of the First World War, they say, well, actually it's the Second World War that is the moment, that is the watershed for women in Britain, for example. It's the moment, and in France, women finally get the vote after Second World War, and it's a moment in a sense when things have more of a lasting change. And that is somewhat to do with the roles that women take on in wartime. And obviously in Britain, people are basically conscripted into service, women and men, women into just different types of roles, but very large numbers are taken on, replacing men in various different areas. And as well, just the sheer extent of total war, something quite different, meaning that society has to be remade afterwards. Now, we do obviously have lots of Irish women who, become active in the war effort in the Second World War, traveling to Britain to work as nurses, for example, working in munitions factories and so forth. Obviously women in Northern Ireland. My study is a 32 county history. My study World War II, in so much as it is beginning, is also. And so, Belfast women have continue to have a war experience. So Mary Muldowney has done really interesting oral history interviews with women from Dublin and Belfast who lived through the Second World War. And it's interesting, even for women in the emergency, that the war still, is this moment of transformation, of change within their own lives. But it doesn't have the same, uprooting of society leading to significant change afterwards in Ireland. And really, the pivotal moment for Ireland, for Irish women, for societal change is Ireland joining the EEC, later EU. It's the 1970s, and many historians say 1922, women getting the vote in equal terms with men, is the last piece of progressive legislation for women until 1973. And the repeal of the marriage bar and so forth, all of which follows Ireland's EU membership. And it's interesting because that is once again Ireland becoming part of something international, becoming less insular, looking outward, and so it's again, the sort of common links in a sense. But it really is that moment. So the war itself, although for women who lived through the First World War and then lived through the Second World War, despite the fact of Ireland not being actively involved, they just still experience it, and it's still a moment of great distress for many of them. But as I say, it doesn't have that same, it's not that a moment in women's rights, and women's emancipation, and the timeline diverges, I suppose, quite significantly from Britain in that respect.
That's great. Thanks. And you didn't mention the Late Late Show. Great stuff.
Yes. When sex arrived in Ireland.
Yeah. So we got away with that. So thank you very much, Fionnuala. We're going to have another talk for this series. We're not sure what date it's exactly going to be. It's going to be in early September, and Colin McGarrett is going to talk to us about the teaching of Irish history in schools. So I'm sure you're all giving Fionnuala a virtual clap, as I am, and we can just say thank you very much.
And thank you all very much for your questions and comments in the chat. It's been a real pleasure doing this today.